When Mikhail Gorbachev took office as the supreme leader in 1985, as the Soviet supreme leader in 1985, he oversaw a country at the peak of its power. The Soviet Union boasted the world's largest military, dominated half of Europe, and had an influence that spanned the globe. Gorbachev, who died yesterday at the age of 91, has been credited for overseeing the reforms that led to the fall of the communist system. But that was never his goal. He saw the desolation and decay of Soviet life and set out to save communism, and in the process led to its downfall. Joining me now to discuss the life and legacy of Mikhail Gorbachev is Professor William Inboden. He's the executive director and William Powers Jr. chair at the William P. Clements Jr. Center for National Security at the University of Texas at Austin. I think I got that right. He is also the author of the forthcoming book, The Peacemaker, Ronald Reagan, the Cold War, and the World on the Brink. Professor Inboden, welcome to Washington Watch.
Thank you, Joseph. It's great to be with you.
It's good to have you with us. This is an important story. To be honest, when I first heard the news that Mikhail Gorbachev had died, I was somewhat surprised with the realization that he had been alive all of this time, because it had been so long since we have heard from him on the public stage, at least so long since I had heard from him. But we want to hear a little bit of his story. He took office as the Soviet leader in 1985. He left somewhat ignominiously in 1991. How did he get there?
So Gorbachev, over the course of his life, had been your classic loyal Soviet. You know, he came from poverty in a rural part of the southern Soviet Union, but joined the party at a young age, showed some intelligence and promise. And over the succeeding decades, he worked his way up. You know, the Soviet Communist Party was very hierarchical. So he started in the hinterlands as a low-level party official and just worked his way up until by the early 1980s, he had joined the Politburo, which was the main body of Soviet leadership there in the Kremlin. And then when the last Soviet leader before him, Konstantin Chernenko, died, Gorbachev was then tapped to be the Soviet leader in March of 1985.
So during the time that he ruled the Soviet Empire, the Soviet Union had been around for a long time. It was this global power. What was his ambition? What were his hopes?
So, this is where Gorbachev is a fascinating figure, where when he took office, as you mentioned, the Soviet Union stood near the apex of its power externally, but Gorbachev and a very few other people high up in the Kremlin realized that internally the Soviet Union was just rotting away, that Soviet communism was a vile, oppressive, evil system. It was an inefficient economy, and it was really rotting away. And so Gorbachev, while being a dedicated, true believing communist, he still revered Lenin, the founder of Soviet communism. He wanted to reform Soviet communism. So he wanted to preserve Soviet power, preserve the Communist Party's rule over the Soviet Union, but do it in a somewhat more efficient and humane and reformed way. And as I talked about in a World Magazine article, that was an impossible balance for him to do. But those were his goals when he came to power.
And I want to dig a bit more into that, because in your article, you point out the fact that he cut the Soviet nuclear arsenal. He withdrew Soviet troops from Eastern Europe. He released thousands of political and religious prisoners from the Gulag. That was different than his predecessors. It doesn't seem like the stereotypical Soviet action. And one might look at that and assume he was just a nicer guy and he wasn't quite as committed to communism than his predecessors. Is that true or not?
It's partly true, right? So by relative standards, by Soviet standards, he was not as vicious. He was not as brutal. He did undertake a number of those reforms. But again, it bears repeating, he remained a dedicated communist to the end until he left office in 1991. And as far as we can tell, until his dying day just yesterday. So he was looking for ways to preserve the Soviet system, to preserve the Soviet Union as a an empire, really, and to extend its longevity. But he just realized that it needed to recapture some sense of trust and loyalty from its people who had really grown to detest this oppressive government, that it needed to lift some of its oppressive control of its Eastern European satellites, whether it was East Germany or Czechoslovakia or Poland or other Central and Eastern European countries. He knew he needed to ease up that control. And he knew that the Soviet Union just could not continue economically, that it was bankrupting itself. And that's primarily because Soviet communism didn't work as an economic system. But again, as you know, it's also because of the pressure from the American president, Ronald Reagan. And I think we can't talk about Gorbachev's legacy without talking about President Reagan's strategy and vision.
Yeah, I want to get exactly into that. I got one other question on this, though, because when Americans, when Westerners, I think, hear the name Mikhail Gorbachev, we think about the fall of the Soviet Empire. We think about the destruction of the Berlin Wall. All of these things are, in our minds, from our perspective, wonderful developments that he was part of. How do Russians think about Mikhail Gorbachev?
Most Russians detest Mikhail Gorbachev. And this is, again, one of those ironies of history, because I do think he was well-intentioned towards his country. But the fact that he presided over the collapse of the Soviet Union, that eventually it led to humiliation and weakness and corruption and poverty for many of the Russian people. Whatever his good intentions were, the outcomes were not seen as so good by most Russians. And, the current Russian dictator, Vladimir Putin, also detested Gorbachev, and he really capitalized on this. One reason we hadn't heard from Gorbachev in recent years, as you mentioned, a lot of us forgot that Gorbachev was still alive, was because Putin had really shunted him off to the side, because Gorbachev is a very, resented and detested figure in Russia. And most Russians just wanted to forget him. They associate him with the humiliation and weakness of the past.
Well, as you mentioned, it was not just Gorbachev, but the other central figure in the fall of the Soviet Union was President Reagan. Tell us a bit about their relationship.
So it's a fascinating relationship where it over the 4 years of Reagan's second term, the time that Reagan was president while Gorbachev was his Soviet counterpart, we need to remember that they were rivals and adversaries. Our countries still were at odds in the Cold War. Reagan's goal was to defeat Soviet communism, to destroy the Soviet system, whereas Gorbachev's goal was to preserve it, right? So there's certainly an adversarial relationship there. But in the midst of that, they also built a genuine friendship and a genuine partnership for bringing the Cold War to a peaceful end, as opposed to ending the Cold War through violent military conflict. And so by the time Reagan leaves office, there's real affection between him and Gorbachev, and a real appreciation that the two of them had together, I think, made the world a more peaceful and less dangerous place.
Now, Professor Inhofe, in the article that you wrote for World Magazine today, you say that you give President Reagan more credit for the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union than you do Gorbachev. And I know this is an issue that historians debate. I am not a historian, so I'm not going to enter that debate. But tell us why you give President Reagan more of that credit.
So, yes. So a key thing to understand is President Reagan is sworn into office in January of 1981, over 4 years before Gorbachev comes to power. And Reagan's strategy towards the Soviet Union, he called it peace through strength, was to bring tremendous pressure on the Soviet Union, to outspend them militarily, to outbuild them militarily, to put pressure on their economy, to support Christians and Jews who were in the Gulag, who wanted religious freedom and freedom to worship and freedom within their own country. Reagan wanted to bring all that pressure on the Soviet Union so that the Soviet Union would have to produce a reformist leader. So I have a chapter in my book called Waiting for Gorbachev, because Reagan had been trying to pressure the Soviet system to produce just such a reformist leader as eventually Gorbachev was. And so I don't think we can understand Gorbachev even coming to power 4 years later without first understanding everything President Reagan had done to kind of back the Soviet Union into a corner where even the senior Soviet leaders realized we are about to collapse as a country and as a system unless our last chance is to bring up a more reform-minded leader such as Gorbachev. And then from there, for the next 4 years, once Gorbachev comes to power, Reagan keeps the pressure on. There's a misnomer out there that in his second term, Reagan went more soft or only wanted to do friendly diplomacy with the Soviets. That's not true at all. In 1987, he's telling Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Reagan continues his military buildup. He continues supporting the freedom fighters in Afghanistan who were, trying to eject the Soviet occupation forces. He partners with Pope John Paul II to support the Catholic Solidarity movement in Poland. So Reagan is continuing all this pressure on Gorbachev during that second term, while also extending the hand of friendship. And it's a remarkably sophisticated strategy by President Reagan, combining that pressure and that diplomacy. And that really boxes Gorbachev into a corner where Gorbachev realizes I have no choice but to negotiate, but to do these reforms, but to negotiate with this American leader.
We're speaking with Professor William Inboden about the legacy of Mikhail Gorbachev on the day after his death. And Will, would you say, is it fair, in light of the pressure and the negotiations and the diplomacy and the relationship between Gorbachev and Reagan, is it fair to say that Gorbachev's views changed over time, or did he just respond to a changing landscape?
No. I think a lot of it is the latter, Joseph. I think a lot of it is Gorbachev just realized that he had a weaker and weaker hand to play. When he came into office in 1985, he knew he had some challenges. But as he continued to learn more about his own government and his own system, realized that it's built on this edifice of lies, realized that so many of the Soviet people detested their own government, that so many of the peoples of Eastern Europe did not want to live under communist tyranny and slavery like that. Gorbachev just started to realize that there was, almost no way out. Now, in the midst of that, he did arrive in office with a much more negative view of President Reagan and the Americans. His initial intelligence assessment by the KGB said that Reagan is very dangerous. He's out to destroy us. You can't trust him. Gorbachev does change over time and realizing that President Reagan did want to bring peace to the world, but he wanted to Reagan thought that the biggest obstacle to peace was Soviet communism, and so that was that very delicate balance that President Reagan was striking. And then finally, as I mentioned in the article, President Reagan was a very dedicated man of Christian faith. Gorbachev was an atheist, and Reagan had a real personal hope to see Gorbachev come to believe in God and come to faith. And so, in the midst of their negotiations over Afghanistan and Eastern Europe and the Berlin Wall and nuclear war, Reagan was sharing the Christian gospel with him, encouraging him to read the Bible, encouraging him to believe in God. I don't know that Gorbachev ever did, but I do think we see some evidence of at least a little bit more openness on Gorbachev's part of realizing that Christians and Jews in the Soviet Union were not his enemy, that they were peaceful believers who just wanted more freedom for themselves and for their country. So in those are some ways that I think Gorbachev may have changed a little bit about taking a more positive view towards religious believers.
An underrated part of the church's engagement in the culture and in the world is the opportunities to share the gospel with people who otherwise would never be able to hear it. Now, Professor, we mentioned that in 1991, after several coup attempts, Gorbachev left office. What had he been doing since 1991?
So, for a while, Gorbachev became, and I use this a little bit ironically, a good capitalist in terms of he went on the international speakers circuit. He was commanding, a lot of money giving guest lectures and dinner addresses. He even did a little bit of corporate advertising for a while. He wrote his memoirs, which became best-selling, and was, something of an elder statesman of sorts. And he at least continued that for the next really 15 years or so until about 2006, 2007. But he, as you mentioned, he just had not been heard much from at all over the last decade. And I think that's because he increasingly realized how out of favor he was in his home country and that Putin was keeping a pretty close eye on him.
There are many examples of the best opponents of capitalism leveraging it quite well when they have the opportunity to do that. In about 30 seconds, who does he leave behind? What's his family?
His wife, Raisa, died about 20 years ago. I believe he has a daughter who's still alive, but I think she was the only child. So, so not much of a Gorbachev family tree, at least that I'm aware of.
Professor William Inboden. Thank you so much for catching us up on the life of Mikhail Gorbachev. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks. Great to be with you, and blessings to everyone.